The morning sun had barely risen over Auckland when Aroa Williams woke up with butterflies in her stomach. The 16-year-old had been waiting for this day her entire life, the day she would receive her Moko, the sacred facial marking that would connect her to her Maori ancestors and declare her cultural identity to the world. In the kitchen of their modest home in Mount Wellington, her father Tekoa was already preparing a traditional breakfast. The smell of ruina parawa, Maori bread, filled the air as Aroa's mother Sarah braided her daughter's long black hair with trembling fingers. 3 generations of their family had gathered for this momentous occasion. "Your grandmother would have been so proud," Sarah whispered, touching the pendant that had belonged to Tekoa's mother. The precious greenstone had been passed down through generations, and today it seemed to glow with special significance. Outside, more family members began arriving. Uncles, aunties, and cousins streamed through the door, each bringing food and gifts. Aroa's younger siblings, Tane and Mir, ran excited circles around the visitors, their energy adding to the building anticipation. The Tohunga Moko, traditional tattoo artist, Master Rangi, arrived just before 9. He was a respected elder known throughout New Zealand for his deep knowledge of traditional practices. His weathered face bore the full markings of his own Moko, each line telling a story of his Wekapapa, genealogy, and life journey. "Are you ready, child?" Master Rangi asked Aroa, his kind eyes searching her face. She nodded, trying to hide her nervousness behind a smile. He had spent months designing her Moko, incorporating elements that represented her family's history, their tribal affiliations, and Aroa's own emerging identity as a young woman. The ceremony began with karakia, prayers, the ancient words filling the room as family members stood in a circle around Aroa. Tekoa's voice broke with emotion as he recited the traditional blessings, calling upon their ancestors to witness this sacred moment. Master Rangi worked with careful precision, using both traditional and modern tools. Each stroke of his hand was deliberate, accompanied by soft chanting. The pain was intense, but Aroha remained still, drawing strength from her father's steady presence beside her and the encouraging murmurs of her family. Hours passed as the intricate design took shape across her chin and lower cheeks. The pattern told the story of her river, her mountain, her tribe. It spoke of her connection to the land and sea and carried the dreams of her ancestors. During breaks, the family shared stories of other Moko ceremonies in their history. Aroa's great-aunt remembered watching her own mother receive her markings decades ago when such ceremonies were becoming rare due to colonial suppression. Now, their resurgence represented the enduring strength of Maori culture. As the afternoon light began to fade, Master Rangi made his final strokes. He stepped back, nodding in satisfaction at his work. Aroa's mother handed her a mirror with tears in her eyes. Looking at her reflection, Aroa caught her breath. The elegant lines curved perfectly along her features, transforming her face into a living testament of her heritage. She wasn't just Aroa anymore. She was now a visible carrier of her people's stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. The family erupted in celebration, performing a spontaneous haka that shook the walls of their home. The powerful traditional war dance expressed their pride and joy better than words ever could. That evening, as they shared a feast, Aroha sat between her parents, occasionally touching the sensitive skin of her Moko in wonder. She thought about returning to school on Monday, knowing she would face questions and perhaps even challenges. But looking around at her family, at the love and strength surrounding her, she felt ready. "Remember," Tekoa told her quietly, "your Moko is not just a marking. It is your birthright, your identity, your connection to who we are as a people. Wear it with pride, my daughter." Aroha nodded, feeling the weight of tradition and the lightness of belonging all at once. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight was for celebration. She was now a young woman carrying her culture's stories on her skin, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Monday morning arrived with a gray drizzle that seemed to match the tension building in Aroa's chest. She stood at the gates of Auckland Grammar School, unconsciously touching her healing Moko. Several students stopped to stare as she walked through the courtyard, some whispering behind their hands, others offering encouraging smiles. Her best friend Leilani rushed to meet her, eyes wide with admiration. "It's beautiful, Aroa, just like you said it would be." But their happy reunion was cut short by a sharp voice over the school's intercom system. Aurora Williams to the principal's office, immediately. The walk to Principal Henderson's office felt longer than usual. Through the glass walls of the administration area, Aroha could see staff members watching her pass, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Mrs. Chen, her favorite English teacher, gave her a supportive nod as she passed. Principal Richard Henderson sat behind his massive desk, his thin lips pressed into a hard line. He was a tall, lean man with carefully combed gray hair and expensive suits. Today, he wore a red tie that seemed to match the anger in his face. "Sit down, Miss Williams," he said, not looking up from the paper he was pretending to read. When he finally raised his eyes, his gaze fixed on her Moko with poorly disguised disgust. "This," he gestured toward her face, "is completely unacceptable. Auckland Grammar has a strict policy against facial tattoos. It's clearly outlined in the school handbook." Arova's voice shook slightly as she responded, "Sir, this isn't a tattoo. It's a Moko, a sacred Maori cultural tradition. It's protected under New Zealand law." "I don't care what you call it," Henderson cut her off sharply. "This is a prestigious institution with standards to maintain. We can't have students marking up their faces like. He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. "You have two options, Miss Williams," he continued, sliding a document across his desk. "Either you cover it up completely while on school grounds, or you face suspension. Those are your choices." Aroha felt tears threatening to fall but held them back. "I can't cover it, sir. That would be disrespectful to my culture and my family." "Then you leave me no choice." Henderson began filling out a suspension form, his pen scratching aggressively against the paper. "You're suspended until you comply with school policy." "But my exams are next week," Aroha protested, her voice rising. "You can't do this." "I can and I am," Henderson replied coldly. "Perhaps you should have thought about that before making such an unfortunate decision." Arova's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. With fumbling fingers, she typed a message to her father. "Dad, please come. Principal Henderson is suspending me because of my Moko." Henderson watched her with narrowed eyes. "You can wait outside while we contact your parents officially. And put that phone away, it's against school rules." In the outer office, Arova could hear Henderson instructing his secretary to call home. Other students passed by, some offering sympathetic glances. Word was already spreading through the school. 20 minutes later, Tekoha Williams strode through the office doors. Despite his business suit, he carried himself with the dignity of a warrior. His own Moko seemed to darken as he saw his daughter's tears. "What's this about suspending my daughter?" Tekoa's voice was calm but carried an edge that made Henderson's secretary flinch. "Mr. Williams." Henderson emerged from his office, attempting to project authority. "Perhaps we could discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss in private," Tekoa responded, his voice rising. "You're discriminating against my daughter for expressing her cultural identity. This is a clear violation of her rights." Other students had stopped in the hallway, watching through the office windows. Phones were out, recording the confrontation. Henderson's face reddened as he realized this was quickly becoming more than a simple disciplinary matter. "Mr. Williams, if you cannot discuss this calmly, I'll have to ask you to leave." Tekoa stepped closer to the principal, his voice low but intense. "Oh, we'll leave. But this isn't over, Mr. Henderson. Not by a long shot." Taking Aroha's hand, Tekoa led her out of the office. As they walked through the corridors, Aroha could feel her father's anger radiating off him in waves. She knew that look in his eyes, the same look he got when fighting for Maori rights in his work as a cultural advisor. This was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Tekoa Williams sat at his kitchen table that evening, surrounded by papers and legal documents. His laptop screen glowed with open tabs about education laws and cultural rights. The house was unusually quiet. Aroha had gone to her room, still shaken from the day's events. "This isn't just about Aroha anymore," he told his wife Sarah, who placed a steaming cup of tea beside him. Henderson's reaction: there was something more there, something ugly. Sarah nodded, remembering similar battles from her years teaching at other schools. The way he spoke to Aroha, like her culture was something shameful, it reminds me of stories my older students used to tell. The next morning, Tekoa arrived at Auckland Grammar dressed in his finest suit, the one reserved for important meetings and ceremonies. His Moko seemed to catch the morning light as he walked purposefully through the school gates. This time, he had come prepared. In his briefcase were copies of New Zealand's Education Act, human rights legislation, and documentation about the cultural significance of Moko. He had spent half the night making calls to colleagues in the Ministry of Education and the Human Rights Commission. The school secretary tried to tell them he needed an appointment, but Tekoa's presence filled the small office. "Mr. Henderson will see me now," he stated firmly. It wasn't a request. Inside the principal's office, Henderson was speaking on the phone. He held up one finger, signaling Tekoa to wait, but Tekoa reached over and pressed the disconnect button on the phone base. "Mr. Williams," Henderson spluttered, rising from his chair. "This is completely inappropriate." "No." Tekoa's voice was controlled but powerful. "What's inappropriate is your treatment of my daughter. What's inappropriate is your disregard for our cultural practices. What's inappropriate is your obvious prejudice." Henderson's face reddened. "This isn't about prejudice. This is about maintaining standards." "Standards?" Tekoa interrupted, placing his documents on the desk. "Let's talk about standards. Let's talk about the Education Act's provisions for cultural expression. Let's talk about the Human Rights Commission's guidelines on discrimination." As Tekoa spoke, laying out document after document, Henderson's expression shifted from anger to something else: worry. His eyes darted to the door several times, as if seeking escape. "You can't just come in here making accusations." Henderson attempted to regain control. "I have run this school successfully for 5 years. "Success for whom?" Tekoa challenged. "Because I've been doing some research, Mr. Henderson. The number of Maori and Pacific Islander students who've left this school under your leadership is concerning. The lack of cultural programs, the coincidental scheduling conflicts with cultural events." Henderson's face went pale. "You've been investigating me?" "I'm just getting started." Tekoa leaned forward. "My daughter's Moko represents her identity, her wakapepa, her connection to our people. When you disrespect that, you disrespect generations of our ancestors. This is still my school." Henderson's voice wavered slightly. "And I still make the rules." Tekoa stood up slowly, his presence seeming to fill the room. "Then perhaps it's time we examined those rules. And while we're at it, we'll examine your record at your previous schools too. I'm curious about why you left Hamilton so suddenly 3 years ago." Henderson's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. "Are you threatening me?" "No." Tekoa gathered his documents. "I'm promising you that I will uncover every instance of discrimination, every biased decision, every abuse of power. Not just for Aroha, but for every student you've made feel ashamed of their culture." As Tekoa turned to leave, Henderson called out, "You'll need proof for these allegations." Tekoa paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "Oh, I'll find it. You see, Mr. Henderson, you've made a crucial mistake. You didn't just attack my daughter's Moko, you attacked our entire culture. And when you do that, you don't just face me, you face all of us." The door closed behind Tekoa with a quiet click, leaving Henderson alone with his thoughts and his fears. Outside the office, the morning sun caught the lines of Tekoa's Moko, each marking a testament to the strength and resilience of a culture that would not be silenced or shamed. The battle had truly begun. Tekoa's office at the Cultural Heritage Center became his war room. Spread across his desk were stacks of papers, student complaints, transfer records, and disciplinary reports from Auckland Grammar School. His computer screen displayed emails from former teachers who had reached out after hearing about Aroa's situation. "It's like pulling threads from a sweater," he explained to his colleague Mathieu, an education advocate. "The more we pull, the more it all unravels." The first breakthrough came from Mrs. Chen, Aroa's English teacher. She arrived at Tekoa's office after school hours, nervously clutching her handbag. "I've been teaching at Auckland Grammar for 7 years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things changed when Henderson arrived. Subtle things at first. Maori Language Week events getting less funding, cultural performances moved to less convenient times. She pulled out a notebook filled with careful observations, dates, incidents, names of students who had been disciplined or discouraged from expressing their cultural identity. I started keeping track 3 years ago. I knew someday someone would need to know. Tekoa read through her notes, his expression growing darker with each page. There was a pattern. Maori and Pacific Islander students facing harsher punishments for minor infractions, being passed over for leadership positions despite excellent qualifications. The next day, a former administrative assistant called. She had worked under Henderson at his previous school in Hamilton. He left suddenly, she revealed. There were complaints from parents about discrimination, but everything was hushed up. The school board paid settlements, made people sign confidentiality agreements. Tekoa and Mathieu spent hours cross-referencing records, tracking down former students and their families. Some were hesitant to speak at first, old wounds still raw. But as word spread about Aroa's suspension, more people came forward. A Simone family whose daughter was discouraged from wearing her traditional necklace during graduation. A Maori boy who was removed from the debate team after wearing a Paunamu pendant. A Cook Islands student told her traditional language was unprofessional during a school presentation. Look at these test scores, Mathieu pointed to a spreadsheet. Maori students with high grades suddenly dropping in Henderson's classes, always just enough to keep them out of advanced programs. Tekoa received an anonymous email from a current staff member. Check the scholarship recommendations. Compare the academic records with who actually got put forward. Working late into the night, Tekoa and his team uncovered a disturbing trend. Qualified Maori and Pacific Islander students were consistently overlooked for academic opportunities. Their recommendation letters were delayed or lost. Their disciplinary records mysteriously accumulated minor infractions. Sarah brought dinner to his office, worried about the dark circles under her husband's eyes. What Henderson did to Aroa, it wasn't an isolated incident, was it? Tekoa shook his head. It's systematic, calculated. He's been doing this for years, just careful enough to avoid obvious discrimination. But the numbers don't lie. A young intern working with Tekoa discovered something interesting in the school's financial records. The cultural program budget keeps shrinking, but look where the money goes instead. Marketing materials emphasizing the school's traditional values and prestigious heritage. Pictures in these marketing materials showed a carefully curated image of the school. Maori and Pacific Islander students were rarely featured, and when they were, their cultural markers were notably absent. Tekoa worked through another late night, organizing the evidence into a comprehensive report. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from more former students and parents coming forward with their stories. Dad. Aroa stood in his office doorway, concern on her face. You need to rest. He looked up at his daughter, her Moko now healing beautifully. This isn't just about your suspension anymore, sweetie. Henderson and people like him, they want our culture to stay invisible, to be ashamed of who we are. Aroha walked over and hugged her father. Then we'll make them see us. Tekoa nodded, turning back to his work with renewed determination. The evidence was mounting, the stories connecting like pieces of a puzzle. Henderson's carefully constructed system of discrimination was about to be exposed. But Tekoa knew the biggest revelations were still to come. Something in his gut told him they had only scratched the surface of Auckland Grammar's secrets. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An elderly janitor named Bill, who had worked at Auckland Grammar for over 30 years, approached Tekoa in the school parking lot one rainy evening. There's something you need to see, Bill whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. In the old storage room, behind the gym. Henderson doesn't know about it. It's where they used to keep records before everything went digital. That night, after most staff had left, Bill led Tekoa through a maze of corridors to a small, dusty room filled with filing cabinets. The lock was easy to open. Bill had been maintaining these rooms for decades. Nobody comes here anymore, Bill said, pulling out his flashlight. But they never got rid of anything. Principals come and go, but paper stays forever. Tekoa's hands trembled as he opened the first cabinet. Inside were files dating back years, including Henderson's early days at the school. What he found made his blood run cold. There were internal memos, handwritten notes, and email printouts. One document particularly stood out, a confidential letter from Henderson to select board members, dated 3 years ago. We must maintain the school's traditional image. Our reputation depends on presenting a certain standard. While we cannot openly discourage diversity, we can implement subtle measures to preserve our school's distinguished heritage. In another folder, Tekoa found altered test scores. Gifted Maori students had their grades quietly lowered, just enough to keep them out of advanced programs. Pacific Islander students' disciplinary records showed mysterious infractions added after the fact. Look at this. Bill pointed to a box labeled Scholarship Committee. Inside were two sets of student recommendations, one official, one hidden. The hidden set showed glowing recommendations for Maori and Pacific Islander students, never submitted to universities. Tekoa's phone buzzed. A message from Matthew. Found something big in Hamilton. Henderson's old secretary finally talked. There's more. Working through the night, Tekoa photographed everything. His hands shook with both anger and disbelief as he uncovered more documents. There were correspondence with other school principals, sharing strategies to maintain their school's traditional character while avoiding accusations of discrimination. A folder marked cultural events revealed how Henderson systematically undermined cultural celebrations. Budgets were cut, venues suddenly became unavailable, performance times were changed at the last minute to inconvenient slots. But the most damaging discovery came in a small, unmarked envelope at the bottom of the last cabinet. Inside were minutes from private meetings Henderson held with certain board members. They detailed plans to gradually reshape the student body to better reflect their desired demographic. This is what we needed, Tekoa whispered, carefully photographing each page. This proves everything. Bill stood watch at the door, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I should have spoken up sooner, he said quietly. I've watched it happen for years, but I was afraid of losing my job. I'm sorry. Tekoa placed a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. You're speaking up now. That's what matters. As they carefully replaced everything exactly as they'd found it, Tekoa's phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah. Henderson's secretary just called me. Says she has digital copies of emails. Wants to help. Dawn was breaking as Tekoa finally left the school grounds. His USB drive was full of photographs, his notebook filled with details. The evidence was overwhelming, years of systematic discrimination, carefully hidden behind policies and procedures. At home, Aroha was waiting up, despite the early hour. Did you find anything, Dad? Tekoa hugged his daughter tightly. We found everything, sweetie. Henderson didn't just discriminate, he built an entire system to keep our people down on making it look natural, inevitable. What happens now? Aroha asked, touching her Moko gently. Now, Tekoa's voice was firm with determination. Now we show everyone exactly what's been happening at Auckland Grammar. We show them how Henderson and others like him have been working to erase our culture, our identity, our mana. The sun rose over Auckland. Its light catching the curbs of their Moko. Father and daughter stood together, knowing that the next few days would change everything. The truth hidden in those dusty files would finally come to light. The school's darkest secrets were about to be exposed. The story broke on a Monday morning. Tekoa had carefully shared his findings with select journalists, human rights advocates, and education officials. By breakfast time, the headlines were everywhere. Systematic discrimination exposed at prestigious Auckland school. Outside Auckland Grammar's gates, a small group of protesters gathered early. By mid-morning, their numbers had swollen to hundreds. Parents, students, and community members carried signs reading, "Our culture is not your enemy, and mana cannot be suspended." Himi Taipari, a respected Māori elder, led a powerful haka in front of the school entrance. The ground seemed to shake as dozens joined in, their voices carrying across the school grounds. Students inside pressed against classroom windows, watching in awe. This isn't just about one school, Himi told the growing crowd. This is about every child who's been made to feel ashamed of their culture, every parent who's had to watch their children struggle against invisible barriers. News vans lined the street. Reporters interviewed former students who had come forward with their own stories. A Pacific Islander mother wept as she described how her daughter had been discouraged from wearing her traditional necklace during graduation. A former Māori student explained how his academic recommendations had mysteriously disappeared. Inside the school, chaos reigned. Henderson had locked himself in his office, refusing to speak to anyone. The school board called an emergency meeting, but they couldn't enter the building through the crowd of protesters. Sarah Williams organized a group of teachers who stood in solidarity with the protesters. "We've been silent too long," she declared, her voice carrying over the crowd. "We watched it happen, day by day, small decision by small decision. No more." Local Iwi leaders arrived, performing traditional welcomes for the gathered media. They spoke eloquently about the importance of cultural identity and the damage caused by institutional racism. "When you tell our children to hide their Moko, you tell them to hide their very identity," explained Mama Kiri, a revered cultural leader. "When you push our traditions to the shadows, you push our children there too." By afternoon, the protests had evolved into a celebration of culture. Pacific Islander students performed traditional dances. Maori songs echoed across the school grounds. Parents set up food stalls, sharing traditional dishes with protesters and media alike. Aroha stood with her friends, watching as more people arrived. Students from other schools came to show support, many wearing traditional items in solidarity. The crowd now stretched for several blocks. Social media exploded with support. Hashtag Our Culture Alright and hashtag Aroha Strong trended nationwide. Videos of the morning's haka went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times across the globe. The Ministry of Education issued a statement announcing an immediate investigation. The Human Rights Commission declared they would launch their own inquiry into Henderson's actions and similar practices at other schools. As the sun began to set, Tekoa addressed the crowd. He stood tall, his Moko catching the evening light, his voice strong and clear. "Today, we stand not just for Aroha, not just for Auckland Grammar students, but for every child who has ever been told to be less than who they are. We stand for every parent who has watched their child's spirit dim under the weight of discrimination. We stand for our ancestors, who fought to preserve our culture, and for our children, who deserve to celebrate it." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. More haka broke out spontaneously across the gathering. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the sea of people united in purpose. Inside his office, Henderson watched through his blinds as his carefully constructed system crumbled. His phone rang constantly, board members, media, ministry officials, but he answered none of them. As darkness fell, the protesters lit traditional torches. They formed a circle around the school, their lights creating a powerful symbol visible from across the city. Local musicians began playing, their melodies carrying messages of strength and unity. "Tomorrow will be different," Aroa said to her father as they watched the gathering from the school steps. "They can't ignore us anymore." Tekovan nodded, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. The evidence was public now, the truth exposed. But more importantly, the community had risen together, turning a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. The night air filled with song and solidarity, a clear message to those who would deny their culture. They would not be silenced, they would not be shamed, they would not be hidden away. The revolution had begun with a Moko, but it would end with transformation. The emergency school board meeting was held in the city council chambers to accommodate the massive public interest. Every seat was filled, with hundreds more watching via live stream. Principal Henderson sat alone at a small table, his usual confidence replaced by visible anxiety. The evidence gathered by Tekoa lay in thick folders before each board member. Board Chair Diana Mitchell opened the session with a trembling voice. "In light of recent revelations, we're here to examine serious allegations against Principal Henderson and review documented evidence of discriminatory practices at Auckland Grammar." The first speaker was the Ministry of Education investigator, who presented a devastating timeline. "We've uncovered a pattern dating back to Mr. Henderson's previous positions. At each school, enrollment of Maori and Pacific Islander students dropped significantly under his leadership." Then came the testimony of former staff members. Henderson's former secretary from Hamilton broke down as she described watching qualified minority students being passed over for opportunities. He would tell us to lose their recommendation letters, to find small infractions to add to their records. A retired teacher spoke about Henderson's private meetings. He told us to maintain what he called traditional standards. We all knew what that meant, but we were afraid to speak up. The most damaging evidence came from Henderson's own emails, projected onto a large screen for all to see. Messages to board members about maintaining the school's elite character. Correspondence with other principals about methods to discourage cultural expressions while avoiding legal issues. Henderson attempted to defend himself. These are all misunderstandings. I was simply trying to maintain academic excellence. Excellence for whom? Tekoa interrupted, standing. The evidence shows you systematically undermine talented students based solely on their cultural identity. The board members exchanged troubled looks as more documents were presented. Financial records showed how cultural program budgets were quietly redirected. Statistical analysis revealed the sharp decline in Maori and Pacific Islander student leadership positions under Henderson's tenure. A human rights lawyer presented findings from similar cases across the country. This isn't isolated. It's part of a larger pattern of institutional discrimination that has gone unchallenged for too long. During a brief recess, Henderson was seen making urgent phone calls in the hallway, his face ashen. When the meeting resumed, more revelations emerged. A current board member, voice shaking, admitted to receiving private directives from Henderson. He said we needed to protect the school's image. He made it sound reasonable, necessary. I'm ashamed I didn't see it for what it was. The evidence mounted hour after hour. Altered test scores, manipulated disciplinary records, hidden correspondence about demographic management. Each revelation drew gasps from the audience. As the sun set outside, Henderson finally broke. I was doing what I thought was best for the school's reputation. Times are changing too fast. Someone had to maintain standards. His outburst echoed through the chamber, followed by dead silence. In that moment, his true beliefs were laid bare for all to see. Board Chair Mitchell called for a vote. One by one, board members raised their hands in favor of immediate termination. The decision was unanimous. Principal Richard Henderson, your employment with Auckland Grammar is terminated, effective immediately, Mitchell announced. Furthermore, we will be forwarding all evidence to the Education Council for review of your teaching credentials. As Henderson was escorted out, Tekoa stood again. This isn't just about one man. The system that allowed this to happen must change. The board agreed. They announced the formation of a cultural advisory committee, with Tekoa appointed as chair. New policies would be implemented to protect and celebrate cultural expression. Outside the chambers, hundreds had gathered to await the decision. When Henderson emerged, he faced a sea of faces, not angry, but determined. Students wearing their cultural markers with pride. Parents standing tall with their children. Teachers ready to embrace change. Aroha, watching from beside her father, touched her Moko gently. We did it, Dad. Tekoa shook his head. No, daughter. We've only begun. Now comes the real work, making sure this never happens again. As night fell over Auckland, the truth had finally emerged in full. Henderson's carefully constructed system of discrimination had been exposed and dismantled. But more importantly, a community had found its voice, and a new chapter was about to begin. The time for hiding was over. The time for change had come. 1 month after Henderson's dismissal, Auckland Grammar School looked different. The morning sun revealed new banners hanging in the entrance hall, celebrating the diverse cultures of its student body. Traditional Māori carvings, gifted by local iwi, now stood proudly at the school gates. The changes were already visible throughout the school. The previously bare walls now displayed student artwork incorporating various cultural motifs. Morning announcements began with both English and Te Reo Māori greetings. Students openly wore their cultural markers, from Moko to traditional jewelry, without fear. Aroha, now in her final year, led a student cultural council. During lunch breaks, they organized cultural sharing sessions where students taught each other about their traditions, languages, and customs. The school cafeteria even started serving traditional dishes from different cultures each week. The Ministry of Education had taken notice. They sent representatives to study Auckland Grammar's transformation as a model for other schools. The new policies being implemented would become guidelines for educational institutions across New Zealand. In the staff room, teachers underwent cultural competency training. Mrs. Chen, who had helped expose Henderson's practices, now coordinated a program where community elders regularly visited classrooms to share their knowledge and stories. The school's academic excellence hadn't suffered. In fact, it had improved. Without the artificial barriers Henderson had created, more students were achieving their full potential. The latest test scores showed significant improvements across all demographic groups. One morning, during assembly, Dr. Cooper made an important announcement. Auckland Grammar is proud to announce our new scholarship program named in honor of Aroha Williams. This scholarship will support students who demonstrate both academic excellence and cultural leadership. The audience erupted in applause. Aroha, sitting with her classmates, felt tears welling up as she touched her Moko. Her father, watching from the back of the hall, stood tall with pride. The school's transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some parents, accustomed to the old way, initially resisted. But as they saw their children thriving in the new, inclusive environment, most changed their minds. The story reached international media. Journalists came to document what they called the Auckland Grammar Revolution. They interviewed students, teachers, and parents about the changes. Magazine articles highlighted how one student's courage to wear her Moko had sparked a national conversation about cultural rights in education. 6 months after Henderson's departure, Auckland Grammar hosted its first Cultural Excellence Day. Students performed traditional dances, shared traditional foods, and displayed artwork celebrating their heritage. The event drew visitors from across the country. During the celebrations, Tekoa addressed the gathered crowd. What happened here wasn't just about fighting discrimination. It was about recognizing that our differences make us stronger. When we embrace all cultures, we all benefit. The school board, completely restructured after Henderson's dismissal, voted to make the Cultural Advisory Committee a permanent part of school governance. They'd also established a review system to ensure no form of discrimination could ever again take root. Aroha, preparing to graduate, reflected on the changes her Moko had sparked. The marking that Henderson had tried to ban had become a symbol of transformation. Younger students now approached her for advice about their own cultural expressions. In the final week of the school year, a special ceremony was held. Community elders from various cultures blessed the school's new beginning. The previous school rules plaque was replaced with a new one that began, "Auckland Grammar celebrates the cultural heritage of all its students." As the sun set on that day, Aroha and her father stood in front of the school one last time before her graduation. The building looked the same, but everything about it had changed. "You know," Tekoa said softly, "sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage." Aroha smiled, watching as students left school for the day, some wearing Moko like hers, others in traditional dress, all walking together with pride. "It wasn't just my courage, Dad, it was everyone's courage to stand up and say, 'This is who we are.'" The transformation of Auckland Grammar became a story told across New Zealand, not just about fighting discrimination, but about building something better in its place. A story about how one school learned that true excellence comes not from exclusion, but from celebration of all cultures. The end was really just a beginning.